Hi, it's Rachel here with my June wrap-up. I read 13 books this month, so I have a lot to talk about, so I'm just going to jump right in. First, I'll start with the rereads. I listened to the audiobook of Fangirl by Rowell, which once again gave me all the warm and fuzzies, all about a college student who is trying to deal with social anxiety. She writes fan fiction and deals with going away for school for the first time, as well as different things going on with her families. I relate to this book so much. I just keep coming back to it. It's one of those books that always makes me feel good, and I think the narration is fantastic. I also reread 2 physical books which I showed in my book haul. The first one being Wintergirls by Laurie Halse. I've already gushed about this book in my last video, but it's all about a young girl struggling with anorexia, and I just think Laurie Halse is such a talented writer about writing authentic teenage narratives, and I really think that she did a great job getting into the head of someone with disordered eating. I read this years ago and was just gripped by the story and was completely gripped by it reading it again, read it in one day and just absolutely love it. Highly recommend. It's not as popular as Speak, but I think it should be. It's just such a good read, so go pick it up. It does not get enough attention. Now, my last reread was a bit more of a classic, and that is The Outsiders by S.E. Hinton. I read this back in high school and absolutely loved it. I didn't read a lot of books that I loved in school, but this was one of them, and I wanted to go back. It's about a group of poor young men who are basically in a gang and just their experiences of life. It's a very emotional read. I don't want to say too much about it. It's incredibly short. If you somehow have not read it, if you didn't have to read it for school, it's still worth picking up. It is considered to be classic young adult, but I definitely think it'll appeal to a wide range of audience, and as an adult I loved it just as much, so highly recommend. I was also on a big romance kick, so I read 3 different books from Clayton. The first one being Screwdriver, which is the 3rd book in her cocktail series, which starts out with Wallbanger being the first. This new book, Screwdriver, takes place with 2 new characters, and I didn't love it quite as much as the first 2 books in the series. It's about a programmer named Viv who basically fantasizes about bodice ripper romances and ends up moving to the country and finding her own romance tale. It just wasn't as funny as I am used to having Clayton's books, and I just didn't relate as much to the characters, so it was a little bit meh, but I'll continue on and read the last book in the cocktail series that I haven't finished yet. The other 2 books are from her new series, the Hudson Valley series. The first one is called Nuts. I actually listened to this as an audiobook and I really enjoyed it. It's about a gourmet chef who loses her job in LA and decides to go back home to work in her mother's diner, and the story is just wonderful. It's everything I love about Clayton. It's great, fun, sexy times. It has decadent food. There's so much witty banter. Because the character is a gourmet chef, there is a lot of talk of delicious, decadent cakes, which made me crave sweet stuff so badly. And the main love interest is a farmer, which for me personally hit the bill, and I just completely enjoyed the story. There were fun twists and turns, and I would highly recommend this one to fans of contemporary romance. Now, I was very lucky to receive an early ARC edition of Cream of the Crop, which is the 2nd book in the Hudson Valley series, which is going to be coming out in July, so it's not out quite yet, but it will be out soon, so definitely you can request it from your library or look to pre-order it. But I requested it, which I rarely do. I rarely request books for early release, but this is one that I just really wanted to read. It is all about a plus-size, confident woman from New York who falls for a dairy farmer. It also takes place in the Hudson Valley series, and it's just sexy and fun. This book has a lot of references to cheese, and I highly recommend you have a wheel of brie on hand while you're reading it, because again, I had such bad cravings. I love that the main character is confident about her body, and the banter is just funny. It's definitely one of the steamier books in Clayton's series. There's a ton of fun, sexy times, and I really enjoyed it. So highly recommend this new series from Clayton. I think anyone who enjoyed Wallbanger, her original book, will really enjoy this new series, because there's a lot of the same themes and tones to it, and it's just a lot of fun. Next, I read Defending Jacob by William Landry, and I was really excited to pick up this book, but my expectations might have been a little bit too high. I originally thought it was more of a mystery suspense thriller, but I would more describe it now as a character study along the lines of We Need to Talk About Kevin. This book is about a defense attorney whose son is accused of murder, and most of the book takes place around his courtroom cases. And I found the legal aspects of the book to be very interesting, but it was very slow at times, and it just wasn't the book I was quite hoping for. I thought there would be gripping plot twists, and it's much more a study of family and what happens, when something like this would just rip apart your family, and just wasn't quite what I wanted to read. So it was alright, not as good as I expected, and it might have had a lot to do with my expectations. I also read a book called Freak, which is the follow-up book to Creep by Jennifer Hillier, which is one of my favorite books of the first part of the year. This book follows a serial killer who's locked up in jail, and basically someone else is murdering people, saying you have to let this person go, and the main characters from the first book get wrapped up in the story. I don't want to say too much as to not give away any of the details from the first book. The second book, Freak, was good. The writing was decent, but definitely not as good as the first book, which tends to be my complaint with most sequels. I rarely love them as much as the first book. I would recommend just treating Creep like a standalone and stopping there. I'm definitely still a fan of Hillier's writing. I definitely like that she doesn't shy away from the dark and creepy and gruesome parts of her stories, but I just think that the story was kind of done after Creep and I didn't need more, so it was alright, but wouldn't necessarily recommend. Then I read When I'm Gone by Emily Bleeker, and this is a really sappy contemporary about a man whose wife dies of cancer. And it's about his basically year after that, where he receives letters from his dead wife in which she encourages him to move on with his life and writes him letters along the way. He's taking care of their children. I'm definitely a sucker for the widowed father trope in books, but yeah, it was really sappy, pretty predictable. It was alright. I think I gave it like 3 or 3.5 stars. It was good at the time, but very forgettable. I already have kind of forgotten that I read it if I hadn't looked at my Goodreads TBR before I started this video. I also read Just One Day by Gayle Foreman as an audiobook, and this is about a young teenager who, before going off to college, goes to Europe and ends up spending one romantic wild day in Paris with a Dutchman named William. And the story starts with that day, which is very romantic and whirlwind, but while the book is called Just One Day, it's really about the year that takes place afterwards, about the main character Allison as she tries to find herself. It deals with a lot of issues like depression and self-awareness, self-identity, finding oneself, growing up. At first I expected it to be more about the romance, and once I realized that it was more of a coming-of-age story, I really started to enjoy it a lot more. I got pulled into the narrative, and while Allison wasn't the most likable character, I think that was done on purpose, and it was a really good read. When it was done, I immediately went to pick up the sequel, which is told from William's perspective, but unfortunately it just wasn't holding my attention, so I did DNF that book. But the first book I thought was really good, and even if you read it as a standalone, I think it holds up really well. I also read Vanish by Elizabeth Heiter, and this is the second book in a series about an FBI profiler. It's a fun suspense thriller type series. It's not incredibly well written. The characters are decent and all of that, but the stories are just really fun, and I've been enjoying it quite a bit. The second story is about a murder of the main character's best friend, who was basically disappeared as a child, and so this is a very personal case she's now working on, trying to figure out what happened to her friend so many years ago. And she's pulled back into the story when someone else is kidnapped in a very similar fashion, so she has to figure out, is a serial killer back or is it a copycat? Again, I found the story super engrossing. It was super fun. I read it in just a couple days. While it's not the best written mystery thriller out there, I think it's a lot of fun, and if you're looking for something to get you out of a reading slump, this is definitely a good one to pick up. I really enjoyed it and plan on reading her next book. Finally, I read 2 graphic novels this month, the first being Superman's Secret Identity by Busiek, And this is a really cool parallel story of Superman. It takes place in a world, basically, which is our world, where Superman exists as a fictional character. So it's just like here, where everyone knows what Superman is, but we don't think he's a real guy, we think he's fiction. And within this world, there's a guy who ironically is named Clark Kent and lives in Kansas. But the twist is that he actually does find out that he has superpowers, and the story takes off from there. This is a great comic book to read if you're not normally a fan of comic books and superheroes. Like myself, I don't read a lot of the books that involve capes and tights, but this is less so about action and more so about the character himself, really looking at his identity and what it means to be a superhero, the challenges of having a quote-unquote normal life while you're trying to save the world and deal with having these powers and the responsibility that comes with having superpowers. Definitely a slower read, don't expect a lot of action scenes, but it was really interesting and I think I gave it 3.5 stars. And the second graphic novel I read was one of my absolute favorite books of the month. It was such a big surprise. This book wasn't even on my TBR. That is El Deafo by Cece Bell, which is a middle grade graphic memoir. It's all about the author's experiences growing up deaf, and while this is a middle grade book, I definitely think it would appeal to a wide audience. I don't tend to read a lot of middle grade, but I was completely enamored by the story. The artwork itself is adorable. The characters are all drawn as rabbits, and the style is super cute. But the story itself is incredibly insightful. It really gives insight into what it was like for her growing up deaf, and more so than her experiences being deaf was how other people treated her because of that. The challenges of making friends, of fitting in, of other people trying to be accommodating but doing it in a way that really made her uncomfortable. And I just think, I feel like I learned a lot, and the story itself was just very insightful, but at the same time incredibly funny. I would highly, highly recommend this one. I haven't heard a whole lot about it on BookTube, and I definitely think it's worth the hype. I absolutely loved it, and it was easily one of my favorite books of the month. That is everything I read this month. I'll have links down below. Please leave any thoughts, questions, comments about any of the books I mentioned, and let me know what was the best book that you read in June. We'll talk more in the comments. Okay, bye-bye.